The thunder rolled across the open plains like a warning, but for Harriet Sullivan, it was already too late. The stagecoach had overturned half a mile back, leaving her stranded in the unforgiving wilderness of Wyoming Territory with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small leather satchel containing her life savings. It was 1878, and the 22-year-old schoolteacher from Boston had been on her way to a new life in Silverton, where she was to take up a position at the newly established schoolhouse. Now, as rain began to fall in heavy sheets, soaking through her traveling dress, she trudged forward, hoping to find shelter before nightfall claimed the last of the daylight. The sky darkened further as Harriet struggled through the muddy terrain. Her boots, fashionable in Boston but wholly inadequate for the rugged landscape, sank deep into the earth with each step. She'd heard tales of the Wild West, of course stories of outlaws and savages, of gold rushes and gunfights, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer vastness of it, the way the land stretched endlessly in all directions, swallowing everything in its path. When she spotted the faint glow of lamplight in the distance, Harriet nearly wept with relief. It took her another 20 minutes to reach the small homestead, a sturdy log cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. By then, her teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and her limbs felt numb from the cold. She hesitated at the door, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. Who might be inside? But with the storm intensifying around her, she had little choice. Gathering her courage, Harriet knocked, the sound barely audible over the howling wind. The door swung open, revealing a tall man with broad shoulders and piercing blue eyes. He wore a weather-beaten Stetson, pushed back on his head, and a worn flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves, revealing tanned, muscular forearms. A gun belt hung at his hip, the handle of his revolver gleaming in the lamplight. "Well now," he said, his voice deep and tinged with surprise. "Where'd you come from, miss?" "The stagecoach," Harriet managed through chattering teeth. It overturned several miles back, the driver and the other passengers. There, she couldn't finish the sentence, the memory of the accident still too fresh in her mind. The man's expression softened. "Comin' out of that rain before you catch your death." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. The cabin was simple but well kept. A fire blazed in the stone hearth, filling the single room with warmth and the comforting scent of wood smoke. A rough-hewn table and chairs occupied one corner, while a narrow bed sat against the far wall. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a pair of saddles rested on pegs near the door. "Name's Henry Blackwood," the man said, taking her satchel and setting it on the table. "Most folks round here just call me Hank." "Harriet Sullivan," she replied, her gaze darting nervously around the cabin. "I was traveling to Silverton to take up a teaching position." Hank nodded, moving to the fire where a pot of something savory smelling bubbled. "Well, Miss Sullivan, you're about 20 miles shy of Silverton, and in this weather you won't be getting there tonight." He ladled stew into a bowl and handed it to her. "Eat. You need to warm up from the inside out." Harriet accepted the bowl gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. The stew was hearty chunks of rabbit and wild onions in a thick broth, and she ate quickly, feeling strength return to her limbs. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found your cabin." Hank shrugged, refilling her bowl without asking. "It's what neighbors do out here, help each other survive." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You've never been west of the Mississippi before, have you?" Harriet flushed, feeling transparent under his gaze. "Is it that obvious?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Your boots gave you away. Fine leather like that won't last a week out here." For the first time since the accident, Harriet found herself smiling too. "I'm beginning to realize there's a great deal I don't know about life in the West." "Well," Hank said, settling into the chair across from her, "you've got time to learn. That storm isn't letting up anytime soon." As if to emphasize his point, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the cabin in a brief, brilliant flash. The thunder that followed shook the very foundations of the structure. "You can take the bed," Hank said, gesturing to the narrow cot. "I'll make do by the fire." Harriet's eyes widened. "I couldn't possibly, Miss Sullivan," Hank interrupted gently. "Out here, pride is a luxury folks can't often afford. Take the bed, you've had a rough day." Too exhausted to argue further, Harriet nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Hank," he corrected. "Mr. Blackwood was my father, and he's been dead 10 years now." Harriet nodded again, feeling the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. "Hank, then." He stood, gathering blankets from a trunk at the foot of the bed. "Get some rest. Things always look different in the morning." As Harriet settled onto the surprisingly comfortable bed, she found herself studying her unexpected host. Hank Blackwood moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to relying on himself, his actions economical and purposeful. He wasn't handsome in the refined way of the men she'd known in Boston, but there was something compelling about his rugged features and direct gaze. Sleep claimed her quickly, the sound of the rain on the roof, and the occasional crackle of the fire lulling her into dreamless darkness. Harriet woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, casting a golden glow across the plank floor. Hank stood at the iron stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. She sat up slowly, suddenly self-conscious of her appearance. Her hair, once neatly pinned, now hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her dress was wrinkled beyond repair. She must look a fright, as if sensing her movement, Hank turned. "Morning," he said, his voice gruff with sleep. "Hope you like your bacon crisp." Harriet pushed her hair back from her face, acutely aware of how disheveled she must appear. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. I'm not pretty in the morning." Hank's gaze held hers for a long moment, something warm and unexpected flickering in his eyes. "You're beautiful every hour, Miss Sullivan," he said simply, before turning back to the stove. "Coffee's hot if you want some." The words settled in the air between them, sincere and without pretense. Harriet felt her cheeks flush, unused to such direct compliments. In Boston, gentlemen couched their admiration in flowery language and practiced gallantry. Hank's straightforward assessment left her momentarily speechless. "Thank you," she finally managed, rising from the bed and smoothing her skirts as best she could. "And please call me Harriet." Hank nodded, sliding a plate of bacon and corn bread in her direction as she took a seat at the table. "Storm's past," he said, pouring coffee into a tin mug for her. "Skies clear as glass this morning." "Then I should be on my way to Silverton," Harriet replied, though the thought didn't bring the relief she expected. Something about the cozy cabin and its solitary occupant made her reluctant to leave. "About that," Hank said, settling across from her with his own plate. "Silverton's still a fair piece from here, and on foot, it'd take you the better part of 2 days. I was planning to ride into town for supplies today anyway. I could take you along if you'd like." Harriet hesitated, weighing her options. She had no horse, no proper boots, and only the vaguest idea of which direction to travel. "I would be most grateful," she finally said, "though I hate to impose further on your kindness." Hank's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "It's no imposition. Like I said, I was headed that way regardless." He took a sip of his coffee, studying her over the rim of his mug. "Besides, Silverton could use a proper teacher. The last one didn't make it through winter." "Didn't make it," Harriet echoed, alarmed. "Packed up and headed back east," Hank clarified. "Said the cold was too much for his constitution." His eyes twinkled with amusement. "You seem made of sterner stuff, though." Harriet found herself smiling in return. "I suppose we'll find out." After breakfast, Hank disappeared outside to tend to his horse and prepare for the journey. Left alone in the cabin, Harriet did her best to make herself presentable. She used water from the bucket by the door to wash her face and hands, then worked a comb through her tangled hair, wincing at the knots. When Hank returned, he carried a bundle of clothing. "These belong to my sister," he explained, placing them on the table. She moved to California a few years back, left some things behind. The dress might be a bit long, but it's clean and dry. Harriet touched the simple calico dress with gratitude. "You're very kind, Hank." He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with her thanks. "I'll wait outside while you change. Take your time." The dress fit better than Harriet had expected, though it was indeed a few inches too long. The accompanying boots, however, were a revelation sturdy leather that came halfway up her calves, with practical heels and room for thick socks. She emerged from the cabin feeling like a new woman, her damp traveling dress folded neatly in her arms. Hank was waiting by a sturdy brown gelding, securing supplies to the saddle. He turned at the sound of the door, and for a moment he simply stared. "Does it look very strange?" Harriet asked, suddenly self-conscious again. "No," Hank said quickly. "No, it looks right, like you belong out here." The compliment, simple as it was, warmed Harriet more than she cared to admit. "Well, I certainly feel more prepared for the journey now." Hank nodded, helping her pack her old dress into one of the saddlebags. "It's about 4 hours to Silverton. Barring any delays, we'll have to ride double." He glanced at her, an unspoken question in his eyes. "That's fine," Harriet assured him, though she'd never ridden double with a man before. Such a thing would have been scandalous in Boston, but out here, practical concerns seemed to outweigh social niceties. Hank mounted first, then reached down to help her up behind him. Harriet settled onto the horse, uncertain where to place her hands. "You'll want to hold on," Hank advised, amusement coloring his voice. "Rusty here has a smooth enough gait, but the trail gets rough in places." Hesitantly, Harriet placed her hands on Hank's waist, feeling the solid warmth of him through his shirt. As the horse began to move, she instinctively tightened her grip, finding herself pressed closer to Hank's back than propriety would allow. But as they left the clearing and entered the vast expanse of the Wyoming wilderness, Harriet found herself caring less about propriety and more about the beauty surrounding them. The sky stretched endlessly above, a perfect blue unmarred by clouds. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer heat. Wildflowers dotted the prairie in splashes of color purple lupine, yellow sunflowers, and the delicate white of wild daisies. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her words nearly lost in the wind. Hank glanced back at her, a genuine smile lighting his features. "Most folks who come out here only see the hardship. They miss the beauty." "How could anyone miss this?" Harriet gestured to the panorama before them. "When you're worried about freezing or starving," Hank said simply, "beauty becomes a luxury." They rode in companionable silence for a time, the rhythm of the horses hooves a soothing backdrop to Harriet's thoughts. Occasionally, Hank would point out landmarks or name the wildlife they encountered: a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, a herd of pronghorn antelope grazing in the distance, the tracks of a mountain lion crossing their path. "Have you lived here long?" Harriet asked as they paused to rest the horse near a small creek. Hank helped her down, his hands lingering briefly at her waist before he turned to lead Rusty to water. "All my life," he replied. "My father came out here in 45, before the territory was even organized. Built that cabin with his own hands, married my mother, raised us kids." "Us," Harriet prompted, settling on a sun-warmed rock by the creek's edge. "5 of us altogether. I'm the youngest. My brothers are scattered now, one in California with my sister, one in Montana, and the oldest, James, he didn't make it back from the war." A shadow crossed Hank's face. "Pa died the winter after we got word about James. Ma followed a year later. Some might say it was the consumption that took her, but I reckon it was grief." Harriet's heart ached for him. "I'm sorry." Hank shrugged, the gesture dismissive but his eyes betraying deeper emotion. "It's the way of things out here. Life hits hard and fast." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing past the surface to something deeper. "What about you? What brings a Boston lady all the way to Wyoming Territory to teach in a frontier town?" Harriet considered the question, surprised to find herself wanting to give him an honest answer rather than the polite explanation she'd prepared for the townspeople of Silverton. "Freedom, I suppose," she finally said. "In Boston, my path was predetermined. Finish my education, become a teacher at a respectable girls' school, eventually marry a suitable gentleman chosen more for his social standing than any genuine affection. And that didn't appeal to you." There was no judgment in Hank's tone, only curiosity. "I wanted more," Harriet admitted. "I wanted to be useful, to make a difference. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Silverton, it seemed like providence, a chance to build something, to help shape a community from its foundations." Hank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "It won't be easy. Frontier towns can be rough places, especially for a woman alone." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Harriet said, lifting her chin, "and I'm more capable than I might appear." "I don't doubt that for a moment," Hank replied, and the sincerity in his voice made her believe him. They remounted and continued their journey, the sun climbing higher in the sky. As they rode, Hank told stories of the land and its people, tales of the Shoshone and Arapaho who had hunted these plains for generations, of mountain men and fur trappers who'd been the first white men to explore the territory, of the cattle barons now staking their claims to vast tracts of rangeland. Harriet listened, entranced not just by the stories, but by the man telling them. Hank Blackwood spoke with a quiet passion about this harsh but beautiful country, revealing a depth of knowledge and understanding that belied his rough exterior. "There it is," Hank said eventually, pointing to a collection of buildings nestled in a valley ahead. "Silverton." Harriet's heart quickened as she took in her first view of what would be her new home. The town was smaller than she'd imagined, perhaps 24 buildings arranged along a main street, with scattered homesteads visible in the surrounding countryside. A white clapboard church stood at one end of the street, its steeple the tallest structure in sight. "It's not much to look at," Hank admitted, "but it's growing. The silver mine brings in new folks regular, and with the railroad spur completed last year, we're not as isolated as we once were." Harriet questioned. "I thought you lived alone at your cabin." "I do," Hank confirmed, "but I come into town often enough. My ranch is small, but I sell beef to the mining company, and sometimes I guide hunting parties when Eastern gentlemen come out looking for trophies." As they approached the outskirts of town, Harriet found herself oddly reluctant for the journey to end. In Boston, she would never have spent hours in such close proximity to a man she'd just met, let alone one who lived alone in the wilderness. Yet something about Hank Blackwood inspired trust, and she'd felt safer with him than she had in a long time. They drew curious glances as they rode down the main street, Hank nodding in greeting to those they passed. He stopped in front of a 2-story building with a sign reading Silverton Hotel and Dining Room. "Mrs. Abernathy runs the place," Hank explained as he helped Harriet dismount. "She's a good woman, if a bit fond of gossip. The school board arranged for you to stay here until the teachers' quarters behind the schoolhouse are ready." Harriet smoothed her borrowed dress, suddenly anxious about the impression she would make. "Do I look presentable enough to meet Mrs. Abernathy?" Hank's gaze traveled from her face to her boots and back again, a slow perusal that made Harriet's cheeks warm. "You look just fine," he said, his voice a touch rougher than before. "More than fine." Before Harriet could respond, the hotel door swung open, revealing a plump, gray-haired woman in a spotless apron. "Hank Blackwood," she exclaimed. "What brings you to town on a Tuesday? Supply day isn't until Friday." "Special circumstances, Mrs. Abernathy," Hank replied, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "This is Miss Harriet Sullivan, your new schoolteacher. Her stagecoach met with an accident yesterday, and she spent the night at my cabin before I could bring her to town." Mrs. Abernathy's eyebrows rose at this information, her gaze shifting speculatively between Hank and Harriet. "Is that so? Well, we're mighty pleased you made it safely, Miss Sullivan. We were starting to worry when the stage didn't arrive on schedule." She stepped forward, enveloping Harriet in a surprisingly strong embrace. "Welcome to Silverton, dear. We've been looking forward to your arrival." "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy," Harriet said, returning the hug somewhat awkwardly. "I'm sorry to arrive so unexpectedly and in such a state." "Nonsense," the older woman declared, ushering Harriet toward the door. "Accidents happen, especially on these rough roads. The important thing is that you're here now, safe and sound." She paused, looking back at Hank. "Will you be staying for lunch, Hank?" "I've got a beef stew simmering that would put meat on those bones of yours." Hank hesitated, his eyes meeting Harriet's briefly. "I should get my supplies and head back. Daylight's burning." "At least come in for coffee," Mrs. Abernathy insisted. "It'll give Miss Sullivan a chance to thank you properly for your gallantry." Something passed between the older woman and Hank, an unspoken communication that Harriet couldn't decipher. Finally, Hank nodded. "Coffee would be welcome, thank you." The hotel dining room was empty at this hour, the lunch crowd not yet arrived. Mrs. Abernathy seated them at a corner table before bustling off to fetch coffee and something to tide them over until the stew was ready. Left alone, Harriet found herself suddenly shy. "Thank you again for bringing me to town," she said, staring at the checkered tablecloth. "I don't know how I would have managed otherwise." "You'd have found a way," Hank replied with quiet confidence. "You strike me as a woman who doesn't give up easily." Harriet looked up, startled by his assessment. "You've known me less than a day. How could you possibly know that about me?" A smile played at the corners of Hank's mouth. "You traveled 2,000 miles alone to teach children in a town you'd never seen, based on nothing more than an advertisement in a newspaper. That tells me something about your character." Before Harriet could respond, Mrs. Abernathy returned with a tray bearing coffee, thick slices of fresh bread, and a crock of golden butter. "Now then," she said, pouring the steaming coffee into mugs, "while you refresh yourselves, I'll send Tommy to fetch Mayor Wilson. He'll want to welcome you properly, Miss Sullivan, and get you settled." As soon as Mrs. Abernathy departed on her mission, Harriet turned back to Hank. "What should I expect from Mayor Wilson? And the town in general?" Hank considered the question as he added a spoonful of sugar to his coffee. "Wilson's a decent enough man. Came out here from Pennsylvania about 10 years ago, started the general store, then got himself elected mayor when the town was incorporated. He takes his responsibilities seriously." He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "As for the town, Silverton's like most mining communities, a mix of hard-working folks trying to build something lasting, and those just passing through looking to strike it rich quick." "And the children?" Harriet asked, her primary concern being her future pupils. "About 20 of school age, last I heard, mostly from mining and ranching families. Some have had schooling before, others haven't seen the inside of a classroom." Hank's expression softened. "They're good kids, by and large. Rough around the edges, maybe, but eager to learn if you approach them right." Harriet nodded, mentally preparing herself for the challenge ahead. She'd taught in a well-established Boston school where education was valued and expected. Here, she would need to convince some families of the very worth of schooling itself. "You'll do fine," Hank said, as if reading her thoughts. "Just remember that book learning isn't the only kind of intelligence. These children know things city kids never will: how to read weather patterns, track animals, survive in the wilderness. Respect that knowledge, and they'll respect what you have to teach them." His advice made sense, revealing yet again a thoughtfulness that belied his rugged exterior. "You're very wise, Mr. Blackwood." "Not wise," Hank countered. "Just been around long enough to see what works and what doesn't." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor Wilson, a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers and an air of self-importance that reminded Harriet of certain Boston aldermen. "Miss Sullivan," he boomed, extending a meaty hand. "Welcome to Silverton. We're delighted you've arrived safely, though most distressed to hear about the accident. Were there any other survivors? The blunt question caught Harriet off guard. She'd been trying not to think about the stagecoach driver and the elderly couple who had been her fellow passengers. I don't know, she admitted. I was thrown clear when the stage overturned. When I regained consciousness, there was no sign of the others. Mayor Wilson's expression sobered. I'll send men out to investigate immediately. If there are survivors, they'll need assistance. He turned to Hank. Blackwood, could you guide them? You know that stretch of road better than most. Hank nodded, already rising from his chair. I'll saddle up now. We should reach the site before sundown if we move quickly. Wait, Harriet said, surprising herself with the urgency in her voice. You're leaving already. Hank looked down at her, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Duty calls, Miss Sullivan. If there's any chance those folks survived, we need to find them fast. Of course, Harriet said, embarrassed by her momentary selfishness. Please go and be careful. A ghost of a smile touched Hank's lips. Always am. He touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Mayor Wilson will see you settled. I expect I'll see you around town before long. With that, he was gone, leaving Harriet with a strange hollow feeling in her chest. She'd known the man barely a day, yet somehow his departure left her bereft, as if something valuable had been taken from her. Mayor Wilson, oblivious to her inner turmoil, launched into a detailed explanation of her accommodations and duties. The school term would begin in 2 weeks, giving her time to prepare the schoolhouse and review the available materials. Her salary would be $30 per month, with room and board provided. The teachers' quarters, a small cabin behind the schoolhouse, were nearly complete, lacking only finishing touches on the interior. Until then, he concluded, Mrs. Abernathy has graciously offered you a room here at the hotel, at the town's expense, of course. Harriet listened and nodded in all the right places, but part of her mind remained fixed on Hank Blackwood, riding back into the wilderness to search for survivors she feared would not be found. The next few days passed in a blur of introductions and preparations. Harriet met the members of the school board, toured the schoolhouse, a simple but sturdy building with rows of rough-hewn desks and a pot-bellied stove for winter heating, and began to familiarize herself with the town. Silverton proved to be a study in contrasts. The main street boasted several substantial buildings. The hotel, general store, assay office, and bank were all constructed of brick or stone, speaking to the town's growing prosperity. Yet just a block away, miners' shacks clustered haphazardly, their canvas or wooden walls offering minimal protection from the elements. The townspeople were equally varied. There were refined ladies like Mrs. Wilson, the mayor's wife, who maintained Eastern standards of dress and decorum despite the frontier setting. Then there were women like Sarah Jenkins, the blacksmith's wife, who wore men's trousers beneath her skirts for practicality and could shoe a horse as skillfully as her husband. Harriet found herself drawn to the latter category, women who had adapted to the harsh realities of frontier life without losing their essential femininity. They welcomed her warmly, offering practical advice about everything from where to buy sturdy winter boots to how to keep bedbugs at bay. Through it all, Harriet found herself watching for Hank, wondering if he had returned from his search mission. On her third evening in town, as she sat on the hotel porch enjoying the cool evening air, her vigilance was rewarded. 3 riders approached from the east, dust rising from their horses' hooves in the fading light. As they drew closer, Harriet recognized Hank's broad-shouldered silhouette leading the group. Her heart quickened inexplicably as she rose to greet them. The men dismounted wearily in front of the hotel, their expressions grim. Mayor Wilson emerged from inside, alerted to their arrival by the sound of horses. Blackwood, he called, hurrying down the steps. What news? Hank removed his hat, running a hand through hair matted with sweat and dust. We found the stage, he reported, his voice rough with fatigue. The driver and 1 passenger didn't make it. They're bringing the bodies in now. His eyes found Harriet on the porch, and something in his expression softened. The older gentleman survived, though he's in bad shape. Doc Turner's tending to him at the way station until he's stable enough to move. A wave of grief washed over Harriet at the news. The elderly couple had been so kind during their journey, sharing stories of their grandchildren in Denver, where they'd been headed to live out their remaining years. "Mrs. Henderson?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hank shook his head, compassion evident in his eyes. "I'm sorry." Harriet nodded, accepting the news with outward composure, though her heart ached for the gentlewoman who had shared candied ginger with her just days before. Mayor Wilson clapped Hank on the shoulder. "You did good work, Blackwood. I'll notify the authorities in Denver about Henderson. His family will want to know." As the mayor led the other riders toward the sheriff's office to report the details, Hank remained behind, his gaze still fixed on Harriet. "How are you settling in?" he asked, climbing the steps to join her on the porch. "Well enough," Harriet replied, gesturing to the empty chair beside hers. "Everyone has been very welcoming." Hank sank into the offered seat with a sigh of relief, stretching his long legs out before him. "Good. Silverton's a young town, but it's got good bones. Good people, for the most part." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as lamps were lit in windows across town, pinpricks of gold against the gathering darkness. "I'm sorry about Mrs. Henderson," Hank said finally. "She seemed a nice lady from what you said." "She was," Harriet confirmed, blinking back unexpected tears. They were on their way to see their grandchildren for the first time. They'd never even met them. Hank's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of comfort that was over almost before it began. Life out here can be cruel that way, beautiful one moment, brutal the next. His words echoed her own impressions of the Wyoming Territory, its breathtaking vistas and harsh realities existing side by side, inseparable as shadow and light. "Will you stay in town tonight?" Harriet asked, changing the subject. Hank shook his head. "No, I'll head back to my place once I've had a hot meal and seen to Rusty. Got livestock to tend to come morning." Disappointment settled in Harriet's stomach, though she chided herself for the feeling. What had she expected? That this man, essentially a stranger, would alter his plans for her company? "Of course," she said, keeping her tone light. "You must have responsibilities." Hank studied her face in the fading light, his expression thoughtful. "I'll be back in town on Friday for supplies." "Perhaps we could continue our conversation then. I'd like to hear how your schoolhouse preparations are coming along." Warmth bloomed in Harriet's chest at the suggestion. "I'd like that very much." The days until Friday seemed to crawl by, though Harriet kept herself busy organizing the schoolhouse and preparing lessons. The previous teacher had left behind a motley collection of books, many in poor condition, and a set of outdated McGuffey readers. Harriet cataloged what was usable, made lists of what was needed, and began to develop a curriculum that would accommodate students of varying ages and abilities. She also continued to explore Silverton, gradually mapping its boundaries and becoming acquainted with its rhythms. The silver mine at the edge of town operated continuously, its stamp mill creating a constant background rumble that residents seemed not to notice. Freight wagons arrived twice weekly, bringing supplies from the railroad depot 20 miles distant. Saturdays saw the town at its busiest, with miners coming in to spend their wages at the saloon or mercantile. By the time Friday arrived, Harriet felt she had gained a reasonable understanding of her new home. She rose early, took extra care with her appearance, pinning her hair in a style that was practical yet flattering, and wearing her one remaining good dress from Boston, and made her way to the general store, where she knew Hank would eventually come for supplies. She browsed the shelves, examining bolts of fabric and considering what she might need for the coming winter. Mrs. Wilson had warned her that Wyoming winters were brutally cold, the snow often piling up to the windowsills of the schoolhouse. "Might I suggest the wool flannel, Miss Sullivan?" A familiar voice said from behind her. "It holds up better to washing than the cotton, and it's warmer for winter garments." Harriet turned to find Hank standing closer than she expected, his hat in his hands and a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd shaved and changed into a clean shirt, she noticed, though his clothes still bore the practical simplicity of a working rancher. "Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him, pleased that her voice sounded calm despite the sudden flutter in her stomach. "Thank you for the advice. I confess I'm somewhat unprepared for the winter everyone keeps warning me about." "Wyoming winters are nothing to trifle with," Hank agreed, "but with proper preparation, they're manageable." He gestured to the fabric she'd been examining. "Were you planning to sew something yourself?" Harriet nodded. "A new winter dress or two and perhaps a heavier cloak. My Boston wardrobe isn't suited to the climate here." "Mrs. Jenkins is a fine seamstress, if you need assistance," Hank suggested. "She makes most of the ready-made garments sold here at the Mercantile." "Thank you, I'll seek her out." Harriet hesitated, then added, "Have you completed your shopping? I was hoping we might continue our conversation as you suggested." "Just about finished," Hank confirmed. "Give me a few minutes to settle my account with Mr. Wilson and I'll join you." "Perhaps we could walk over to the schoolhouse? I'd be interested to see what you've done with the place." 15 minutes later, they strolled side by side down Silverton's Main Street, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Harriet was acutely aware of the picture they presented the new schoolteacher and the solitary rancher, an unlikely pair by any standard. "People are staring," she murmured, feeling self-conscious. Hank chuckled, the sound rich and warming. "Small towns run on gossip, Miss Sullivan. By supper time, half the population will have us engaged to be married, and the other half will be placing bets on how long you'll last as a teacher." "And which half do you belong to?" Harriet asked boldly, surprising herself with the question. Hank's step faltered momentarily before he recovered. "Neither," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I make it a point not to bet on sure things." "And what, in your estimation, is a sure thing?" "That you'll be the finest teacher this town has ever seen," Hank replied without hesitation. "And that the children of Silverton will be better for having known you." His confidence in her abilities, expressed so matter-of-factly, touched Harriet deeply. In Boston, she had been one of dozens of qualified teachers, interchangeable and unremarkable. Here, in this frontier town, Hank Blackwood saw something in her worth believing in. They reached the schoolhouse, a simple white clapboard building set back from the street. Behind it stood the partially completed teachers' quarters, a snug one-room cabin that would be Harriet's home once finished. "Mayor Wilson says it should be ready within the week," Harriet said, gesturing to the cabin. "Until then, I'm quite comfortable at the hotel." Hank nodded, following her into the schoolhouse. Inside, Harriet had been hard at work. The desks were arranged in neat rows, the blackboard cleaned and primed for use, and wildflowers brightened the windowsills in mason jars. "You've been busy," Hank observed, taking in the transformed space. "There's still much to do," Harriet replied, "but it's coming along. I've organized the books by reading level and subject, and I'm developing lessons that will accommodate students of different ages and abilities." Hank moved to the small bookshelf, examining the titles. "Not much to work with," he commented. "No," Harriet agreed with a sigh. "I've written to my former colleagues in Boston requesting donations, but it will be months before anything arrives, if at all." Hank turned to face her, an odd expression crossing his features. "I might be able to help with that," he said slowly. "I have quite a few books at my cabin. They belonged to my mother. She was something of a collector. They've been sitting unused since she passed. You're welcome to borrow any that would be useful." Harriet's eyes widened at the unexpected offer. "That's incredibly generous, Hank. Are you certain?" "She would have wanted them to be used," he said simply. "Especially for education. She taught all of us children to read before we ever saw a proper school. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Hank confirmed, a wistful smile touching his lips. "Educated back east before she married my father and followed him west. Never complained about the hardships, even in the early days when they were living in a tent while Pa built the cabin. Harriet tried to imagine it a refined Eastern woman adapting to life in the untamed wilderness, raising children in a world so different from the one she'd known. She must have loved him very much. Enough to leave everything familiar behind, Hank agreed. Though she always said what she found here was worth far more than what she'd left behind. There was something in his tone, a suggestion of deeper meaning that made Harriet wonder if he was still talking about his mother. When could I come see these books? She asked, steering the conversation back to safer ground. Sunday, if you're free, Hank suggested. I could ride into town in the morning, attend church service, then escort you back to my place for dinner. We could return before dark. The proposal, innocent as it was, carried implications that would have raised eyebrows in Boston society. An unmarried woman visiting a bachelor's home, even with the stated purpose of examining books, would be considered scandalous. But this wasn't Boston, Harriet reminded herself. The rigid social conventions of the East held less sway in a frontier town where practical concerns often outweighed propriety. I would be delighted, she said, making her decision. Shall we meet after the service? Hank's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. It's a plan, then. Sunday dawned clear and warm, the late summer sun casting long shadows as Harriet made her way to the small church at the end of Main Street. She wore her best dress, a deep blue silk that had seemed practical in Boston but felt ostentatious here in Silverton, and carried a small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother. The church was nearly full when she arrived, families packed into the simple wooden pews. Mrs. Abernathy waved her over, making room beside her in the second row. From this vantage point, Harriet could see most of the congregation, but there was no sign of Hank. As the service began, Harriet found herself increasingly distracted, her attention drifting to the door each time it opened. What if he'd changed his mind? What if he'd encountered trouble on the ride into town? It wasn't until the congregation rose for the second hymn that Hank slipped quietly into the church, taking a place in the back row. He caught her eye briefly, touching the brim of an imaginary hat in greeting. Harriet smiled in return, relief washing over her. After the service, as the congregation spilled out onto the church steps, Harriet made her way through the crowd toward Hank. He stood apart from the others, exchanging pleasantries with the pastor but clearly waiting for her. Miss Sullivan, he greeted her, his eyes warming as they took in her appearance. You look lovely today. Thank you, Harriet replied, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. And thank you for coming. I was beginning to worry. Had a fence to mend before I could leave, Hank explained. Found a break in the north pasture line with signs that wolves had been through. Couldn't leave it unrepaired. Such practical concerns were part of the rhythm of life out here, Harriet was learning. Nature didn't pause for Sunday services or social engagements. Are you still interested in seeing those books? Hank asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Absolutely, Harriet confirmed. I've been looking forward to it all week. Hank's relief was visible. Good, I've got Rusty saddled and waiting. If you're ready, we can head out now. Mrs. Abernathy appeared at Harriet's elbow, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Heading somewhere, dear? She asked, her gaze shifting meaningfully to Hank. Mr. Blackwood has kindly offered to lend some books for the schoolhouse, Harriet explained. I'm going to his ranch to select what might be useful. The older woman's eyebrows rose. Is that so? Well, that's very educational of him. She lowered her voice to a stage whisper. Perhaps you should take someone along as a chaperone, dear. A young lady's reputation is a fragile thing, even out here. Before Harriet could respond, Mayor Wilson joined their small group, his wife at his side. Did I hear something about books for the school? He asked jovially. That's mighty generous of you, Blackwood. They're just gathering dust at my place, Hank replied with a shrug. Seems a shame when they could be put to good use. The mayor nodded approvingly. Education's the foundation of civilization, that's what Mrs. Wilson always says. He clapped Hank on the shoulder. You're doing a public service, Blackwood. Miss Sullivan couldn't ask for a more reliable escort, Mrs. Abernathy. Hank here is as honorable as they come." Mrs. Abernathy sniffed, clearly unconvinced but unwilling to contradict the mayor. "Well, just be sure to have her back before dark, Mr. Blackwood. Miss Sullivan has preparations to make for the school opening tomorrow." "Yes, madam," Hank agreed solemnly, though Harriet caught a glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "I'll have her back safe and sound before sundown." With the mayor's implicit approval, their outing had gained legitimacy. Harriet bid goodbye to the Wilsons and Mrs. Abernathy, then followed Hank to where Rusty waited patiently at the hitching post. "I hope I haven't caused you any trouble," Hank said as he helped her mount. Small towns have long memories when it comes to scandal. Harriet settled onto the saddle, arranging her skirts as Hank swung up behind her. "There's no scandal in borrowing books," she replied, though she was acutely aware of his proximity, his chest warm against her back as he reached around her for the reins. "No," Hank agreed, his breath stirring the fine hairs at her nape, "but there might be in how much I've been looking forward to showing them to you." The journey to Hank's ranch passed more quickly than Harriet expected, filled with comfortable conversation and companionable silences. Hank pointed out landmarks along the way, a stream where he fished for trout in the summer, a stand of aspens that would turn golden in another month, the distant peaks where he hunted elk in the fall. When they crested a small rise and the cabin came into view, Harriet was struck anew by its isolation. The nearest neighbor, Hank had told her, was 5 miles away, a day's ride to the nearest town in good weather. How did he bear the solitude? As if reading her thoughts, Hank said quietly, "It's not for everyone living this far out. Some folks need the noise and bustle of town to feel alive. For me, it's the opposite. I need the quiet to hear myself think." The cabin looked different in daylight, smaller, perhaps, but also more welcoming. A vegetable garden grew to one side, neat rows of corn and beans and squash ripening in the summer sun. Chickens scratched in the yard, scattering at their approach. Beyond the cabin, a small barn and corral housed a few cattle and a second horse, a dappled mare who whinnied a greeting to Rusty. "It's lovely," Harriet said honestly as Hank helped her dismount. "So peaceful." Hank's expression held surprise and pleasure at her reaction. Most city folks find it too quiet. They start hearing things that aren't there after a while. "What I hear is the wind in the grass, birds calling, your livestock moving about," Harriet replied. "It's not silence at all, just a different kind of music than I'm used to." Something shifted in Hank's eyes at her words, a warming that made Harriet's heart skip. "You understand," he said simply. Inside, the cabin was as neat as she remembered, though now filled with sunlight streaming through the single window. A quilt in a pattern Harriet didn't recognize covered the bed, its colors faded but still vibrant. Dried herbs and flowers hung from the rafters, filling the air with subtle fragrance. "My mother's books are in that trunk," Hank said, gesturing to a wooden chest at the foot of the bed. "Help yourself. I'll get dinner started." While Hank busied himself at the stove, Harriet knelt beside the trunk and opened it reverently. Inside lay a treasure trove, dozens of books, carefully wrapped in cloth to protect them from dust and damp. She unwrapped them one by one, marveling at the collection. There were classics of literature, Shakespeare, Milton, Dickens, alongside history texts, scientific treatises, and volumes of poetry. Most surprising were the children's books, colorfully illustrated primers and readers that would be perfect for her youngest students. "Hank, these are wonderful," she breathed, turning to where he stood slicing bread at the table. "Your mother had exceptional taste." Hank smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "She believed in the power of books to transport you beyond your circumstances. When winter shut us in for weeks at a time, she'd read aloud every evening. We traveled to London with Dickens, sailed the seas with Melville, explored the heavens with Galileo, all without leaving our cabin." The image of a young Hank, Listening wide-eyed as his mother read by lamplight made Harriet's heart constrict with unexpected tenderness. "What a gift she gave you," she said softly. "One I'd like to pass on," Hank replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Take whatever books you think would benefit your students. They should be read, not stored away in a trunk." "Are you certain?" Harriet asked, overwhelmed by his generosity. "Some of these are quite valuable." "I'm certain," Hank confirmed. Education was important to my mother. She'd be pleased to know her books were helping shape young minds. Harriet carefully selected a dozen volumes basic readers for the younger children, more advanced texts for the older students, and a beautifully illustrated atlas that would help her teach geography. As she made her choices, Hank prepared a simple but hearty meal: venison stew, fresh bread, and early apples from a tree he'd planted years ago. They ate at the rough-hewn table, the open door allowing a gentle breeze to cool the cabin. Their conversation flowed easily, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd visited, memories of their respective childhoods. Harriet found herself laughing more than she had in months, drawn out of her usual reserve by Hank's quiet humor and attentive listening. "You're different here," she observed as they finished their meal. "More relaxed than you were in town." Hank considered this as he poured them each a cup of coffee. "I suppose I am. This is my place in the world. In town, I'm always a bit on guard." "Against what?" "Expectations, mostly," Hank admitted. "When people look at me, they see what they expect to see: just another rough rancher with dirt under his nails and barely enough education to sign his name. It's easier sometimes to let them believe that." "But that's not who you are at all," Harriet protested. "You're well-read, thoughtful, observant. Why hide those qualities?" Hank shrugged, a gesture she was coming to recognize as his way of deflecting attention from himself. "Out here, being underestimated can be an advantage. People reveal more of themselves when they think you're simple." The statement revealed a shrewdness that Harriet hadn't fully appreciated before. Hank Blackwood was a far more complex man than his rugged exterior suggested. "And what do you see when you look at me?" she asked, emboldened by the intimacy of the moment. Hank's gaze traveled slowly over her face, a consideration so thorough it felt almost like a physical touch. "I see a woman of remarkable courage," he said finally. "Someone who left behind everything familiar to pursue a calling. I see intelligence, compassion, and a quiet strength that many might overlook." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "I see beauty, inside and out." The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning. Harriet felt her pulse quicken, aware that they had ventured into territory beyond mere friendship. "Thank you," she said softly, not trusting herself to say more. Hank seemed to understand her reticence. He rose, breaking the moment gently. "We should start back soon if I'm to keep my promise to Mrs. Abernathy about returning you before dark." Harriet nodded, gathering the books she'd selected while Hank packed the remaining food. "No sense in it going to waste," he'd said, wrapping bread and cheese in a clean cloth for her to take back to the hotel. As they prepared to leave, Harriet found herself reluctant to go. There was something about this place, about being with Hank in his natural environment, that felt right in a way she couldn't articulate. "Perhaps," she ventured as he helped her mount Rusty, "you might visit the schoolhouse sometime, when classes begin. The children would benefit from hearing about ranch life from someone with first-hand experience." Hank's hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'd like that," he said, his voice low, "though I'm not much of a public speaker." "You'd be wonderful," Harriet assured him. "You have a gift for making complex ideas accessible. That's rare and valuable in a teacher." Hank mounted behind her, his arms coming around her to take the reins. "Is that what I am now, a teacher?" "We're all teachers in our own way," Harriet replied. "We share what we know, what we've learned through experience. That's how communities grow." As they rode back toward Silverton, Harriet leaning comfortably against Hank's solid presence, she found herself imagining a future where such journeys were commonplace, where the distance between town and ranch was bridged regularly by shared purpose and growing affection. It was a dangerous line of thinking, she knew. She'd come to Wyoming to establish herself as an independent woman, to build a career and a life on her own terms. Developing feelings for a solitary rancher had never been part of her plan. Yet as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber, Harriet couldn't deny the warmth that filled her at Hank's proximity, or the sense of rightness she felt in his company. The next morning, standing before her assembled students for the first time, Harriet's thoughts kept returning to Hank. She wondered what he was doing at that moment, mending fences, perhaps, or tending to his livestock. Was he thinking of her too, Miss Sullivan? A small voice broke into her reverie. "Are we going to start learning now?" Harriet blinked, bringing her attention back to the classroom. 20 faces looked up at her expectantly, children ranging in age from 6 to 16, dressed in their Sunday best for the first day of school, some eager, others wary, all waiting for her to begin. "Yes, indeed we are," she replied with a warm smile. "Welcome to Silverton School. I'm Miss Sullivan, and I'm very pleased to meet each of you." As she led the children through introductions and began to assess their various levels of knowledge, Harriet found her initial nervousness giving way to confidence. This was her element, after all. Whatever uncertainties she might feel about her personal life, in the classroom, she knew exactly what to do. The day passed quickly, filled with the familiar rhythms of teaching questions and answers, reading aloud, simple arithmetic exercises. The children, while less polished than her Boston pupils, showed a refreshing eagerness to learn and a practical intelligence that impressed her. When the final bell rang at 4 o'clock, Harriet stood on the schoolhouse steps, watching her students scatter to their various homes. She felt a deep satisfaction in the day's work, a sense that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Went well, did it?" a familiar voice asked. Harriet turned to find Hank leaning against the hitching post, Rusty grazing contentedly nearby. He'd clearly made an effort. With his appearance, his shirt was clean, his hair neatly combed, his boots polished. "Very well," she confirmed, pleasure warming her voice. "What brings you to town on a Monday?" Hank straightened, approaching the steps with an almost boyish uncertainty. "Thought I'd see how those books were working out," he said, though the excuse sounded thin even to Harriet's ears. "And I brought you something." From behind his back, he produced a small bouquet of wildflowers, purple lupine, golden sunflowers, and delicate white daisies, tied with a simple string. "First day of school deserves some celebration," he explained, offering her the flowers. "It's not much, but they're perfect," Harriet interrupted, taking the bouquet and inhaling their sweet scent. "Thank you, Hank. This is very thoughtful." A flush of color rose in his tan cheeks. "It's nothing. Just thought you might like a reminder of the prairie to brighten your new quarters." He gestured to the cabin behind the schoolhouse, now completed and ready for occupancy. "I hear you're moving in today." "Yes, Mrs. Abernathy helped me bring my things over this morning before school." Harriet hesitated, then added impulsively, "Would you like to see it? It's quite charming, really." The invitation was forward, perhaps inappropriately so, but Harriet found she didn't care. She wanted to share this moment, this milestone, with Hank. "I'd be honored," he replied, his expression suggesting he understood the significance of the invitation. The teachers' quarters were indeed charming, a single room with a small kitchen area. A cast iron bed with a colorful quilt donated by the ladies of the church. A writing desk positioned near the window to catch the best light, and a pot-bellied stove in the corner for heating. Harriet had already added personal touches, her books arranged on a small shelf, a crocheted doily on the bedside table, a china pitcher filled with water on the washstand. "It's not very grand," she said as Hank ducked through the low doorway, "but it's mine. The first home I've ever had that wasn't shared with family or boarders." Hank looked around approvingly. "It's a good space, solid construction." He moved to the stove, examining it with a professional eye. This will keep you warm enough in winter, though you'll want to bank the fire at night to keep it going until morning. His practical concerns touched Harriet. It was one thing to bring flowers, another entirely to ensure she would be warm through the Wyoming winter. "Perhaps you could show me how," she suggested. "I've never maintained a stove before." "Of course," Hank agreed readily. "It's not difficult once you know the trick of it. I could come by some evening this week, if that would suit." "That would be wonderful," Harriet said, placing the wildflowers in the china pitcher. "And perhaps you could stay for supper. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage a simple meal." The invitation hung between them, weighted with possibilities. In Boston, a single woman inviting a man to dine alone in her home would be scandalous. Here in Silverton, it might raise eyebrows, but the practical necessities of frontier life allowed for some bending of social conventions. "I'd like that," Hank said after a moment, his voice rough with what might have been emotion. "How about Thursday? I'll be in town for the cattle auction anyway." "Thursday it is," Harriet confirmed, a flutter of anticipation already building in her chest. Thursday evening arrived with uncomfortable swiftness. Harriet spent the afternoon after school preparing a simple supper rabbit stew with carrots and potatoes purchased from Mrs. Jenkins, fresh bread from the hotel bakery, and an apple pie that Mrs. Abernathy had insisted on contributing when she heard about the dinner invitation. "Just being neighborly," the older woman had said with a knowing smile that made Harriet blush. By the time Hank knocked on her door at 6 o'clock, Harriet had changed into her best everyday dress, tidied the cabin until it gleamed, and worked herself into a state of nervous anticipation that she hadn't felt since her first teaching position. "Evening," Hank said when she opened the door, his hat in his hands and a small wooden box tucked under his arm. "Something smells mighty good." "Rabbit stew," Harriet replied, stepping back to let him enter. "Though I can't take much credit, Mrs. Jenkins provided the rabbit already dressed and ready for cooking." Hank smiled, handing her the wooden box. "Brought you something for your kitchen." Inside the box lay a set of hand-carved wooden spoons and utensils, each piece smooth and perfectly balanced, the wood rich with natural oils and use. "I made them years ago for my mother," Hank explained, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "She always said good tools make cooking less of a chore." "Thought you might find them useful, being new to keeping house and all." Harriet ran her fingers over the smooth surfaces, touched beyond words by the gift. These weren't just utensils, they were family heirlooms carrying memories and history. "Hank, I can't accept these," she said softly. "They should stay in your family." A shadow crossed his face. "I have no one to pass them to," he said simply. "No wife, no children, they just sit unused in my cabin, better they should serve a purpose." The statement, delivered without self-pity, but with quiet resignation, pierced Harriet's heart. She thought of Hank in his isolated cabin, surrounded by the remnants of a family now scattered or gone, living a solitary existence that few could endure. "Then I accept them with gratitude," she said, meeting his eyes. "And I promise to use them well." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, perhaps, or a recognition of shared loneliness. Whatever it was, it shifted the atmosphere from polite hospitality to something more intimate, more honest. The evening that followed was one Harriet knew she would remember always. They ate at her small table, the stew and bread accompanied by easy conversation that ranged from the day's cattle auction to her students' progress to books they both enjoyed. Hank showed her how to properly maintain the stove, explaining the mechanics of dampers and flues with patient detail. As they shared Mrs. Abernathy's apple pie, sitting side by side on Harriet's narrow bed, the only seating available once they'd moved from the table. Hank spoke of his plans for the ranch expanding his herd, perhaps building a larger cabin come spring, adding an orchard like the one his mother had tended in his childhood. "It sounds like you're putting down deeper roots," Harriet observed, aware of his shoulder pressing against hers, solid and warm. Hank nodded, his profile strong in the lamplight. I've been drifting in place, if that makes sense. Going through the motions of living without really building anything lasting. He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. Lately, I've been thinking that might be a mistake. What changed? Harriet asked, though something in her already knew the answer. Hank's gaze held hers, unwavering. I met someone who made me see possibilities I'd stopped looking for. The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. No flowery declarations, no practiced gallantry, just simple truth, offered without expectation or demand. Hank, Harriet began, uncertain what she meant to say, but feeling the need to respond to his openness with honesty of her own. Before she could continue, the school bell began to ring, its urgent clanging splitting the quiet evening. A moment later, shouts could be heard from the direction of Main Street. Fire, someone yelled. Fire at the livery stable. Hank was on his feet in an instant, reaching for his hat. Stay here, he instructed, already moving toward the door. I'll come back when it's under control. But Harriet was right behind him, grabbing her shawl from its peg. I'm coming with you. There might be children in danger or people needing assistance. The look Hank gave her was equal parts exasperation and admiration. Stay close to me then, he conceded. And do exactly as I say if things get dangerous. They ran toward the center of town, joining a stream of citizens responding to the alarm. The livery stable was already engulfed in flames, the dry wood and hay burning fiercely. A bucket brigade had formed, passing water from the town well to the firefighters at the front lines, but it was clear the stable itself was lost. The focus now was on preventing the fire from spreading to neighboring buildings. The horses, someone shouted. Get the horses out. Hank immediately joined a group of men rushing toward the burning structure. Harriet, ignoring his earlier instruction to stay close, moved to help the women organizing care for those already affected, a stable boy with singed hair and eyebrows, the livery owner with burns on his hands from trying to free the animals, an elderly couple evacuated from the adjacent boarding house as a precaution. For hours, the town battled the blaze. Harriet tore strips from her petticoat to bandage burns, carried water to exhausted firefighters, and helped evacuate possessions from buildings threatened by the spreading flames. Through it all, she caught glimpses of Hank in the thick of the danger, leading terrified horses from the burning stable, manning the bucket brigade, helping to tear down a small shed to create a firebreak. It was well past midnight when the fire was finally contained. The livery stable was a total loss, and 2 adjacent buildings had suffered significant damage, but the rest of the town had been saved. Exhausted citizens gathered in small groups, taking stock of injuries and damage. Harriet found Hank sitting on the edge of the horse trough, his face and clothing blackened with soot, his hands raw from handling burning debris. Without a word, she knelt before him, dipping her handkerchief in the cool water to gently clean his hands. You should have stayed back, he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. It was dangerous. So should you, Harriet countered, continuing her ministrations. Yet here we both are. A tired smile curved Hank's lips. Stubborn woman. Reckless man, she returned, but there was no heat in the exchange, only mutual respect and something deeper, something neither was quite ready to name. Come on, Hank said finally, rising stiffly to his feet. Let me walk you home, you must be exhausted. They made their way slowly back to the teachers' quarters, the excitement of the fire giving way to bone-deep weariness. At her door, Hank hesitated. I should go, he said, though he made no move to leave. It's late, and you have school in the morning. Harriet knew he was right. The proprieties must be observed, especially now when they were both too tired to think clearly. Yet the events of the night had stripped away some barrier between them, revealing a partnership forged in crisis. Thank you, she said simply. For everything? Hank nodded, understanding in his eyes. We'll talk soon, he promised. About possibilities. Yes, Harriet agreed. We will. As she watched him walk away, straight back despite his exhaustion, Harriet felt a certainty settle in her heart. Whatever happened next, her life had become irrevocably entwined with Hank Blackwood's. The thought should have terrified her, she who had valued independence above all else, but instead, it filled her with a quiet joy. The weeks that followed were busy ones for Harriet. The school term was in full swing, with her days filled with lessons and her evenings occupied with grading assignments and preparing for the next day's classes. The fire had disrupted the town's routines, creating additional responsibilities as the community worked together to rebuild the livery stable before winter set in. Through it all, Hank was a constant presence. He rode into town more frequently now, ostensibly to help with the rebuilding efforts, but inevitably finding his way to the schoolhouse at day's end. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a jar of honey from wild bees, a particularly interesting rock formation he thought might help illustrate a geology lesson, fresh venison when he'd been hunting. Other times, he simply appeared at her door with an offer to chop wood for her stove or to escort her to a community event. Their relationship developed in full view of the town, subject to the curious eyes and wagging tongues that characterized small community life. Yet no one seemed particularly surprised by their growing attachment. If anything, there was an air of collective satisfaction, as if Silverton had been waiting for its solitary rancher and new schoolteacher to discover what was obvious to everyone else. "You and Hank make a fine pair, Mrs. Jenkins remarked one Saturday as Harriet selected fabric for winter curtains at the general store. "He's different with you lighter somehow, like a weight's been lifted." "We're friends," Harriet demurred, though the word felt inadequate for what was growing between them, Mrs. Jenkins' knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "Friends is where all good marriages start, my dear. Tom and I were friends for a year before he got around to proposing." The casual mention of marriage sent a flutter of panic through Harriet. Was that where this was heading? And if so, was she ready for it? She'd come west to establish herself as an independent woman, to build a career and a life on her own terms. Marriage had never been part of her plan. Yet when Hank appeared at her door that evening, his hair still damp from washing up after a day working on the new livery, Harriet felt the familiar quickening of her pulse, the sense of rightness that his presence always brought. "Thought you might like to ride out to the foothills tomorrow after church," he suggested as they sat on her small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in vivid oranges and pinks. "The aspens are turning. It's quite a sight." "I'd love to," Harriet replied, setting aside her concerns for the moment. Tomorrow was Sunday, after all, a day for rest and reflection. Perhaps the open spaces would bring clarity to her confused thoughts. The aspen grove was even more beautiful than Hank had described. The trees stood like sentinels on the lower slopes of the mountains, their leaves shimmering gold in the autumn sunlight. Against the backdrop of evergreen pines higher up and the deep blue sky above, the effect was breathtaking. They had ridden double on Rusty, with a picnic lunch packed in the saddlebags. Now, spread on a blanket in a small clearing among the aspens, they shared bread and cheese and the last of summer's apples, their conversation flowing easily as always. "Winter will be here soon," Hank observed, leaning back on his elbows to gaze up at the canopy of golden leaves. "First snow usually comes by late October." "So everyone keeps warning me," Harriet replied with a smile. "I'm beginning to think Wyoming winters must be fearsome indeed, given how much preparation they seem to require." "They can be harsh," Hank acknowledged, "but there's beauty in them too. The way snow transforms the landscape, the silence after a storm, the crystalline quality of the air on cold mornings." He looked at her thoughtfully. "You'll need someone to check on you regularly once the heavy snows begin. The path between your cabin and the schoolhouse can drift deep enough to be dangerous. Are you volunteering?" Harriet asked lightly, though her heart beat faster at the implication of his concern. "I am," Hank confirmed, his expression serious. though I'd prefer a more permanent arrangement." Harriet's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Hank sat up, turning to face her fully. "I've been thinking a lot about what I said that night before the fire, about possibilities." He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. "Harriet, I know you came out here to be independent, to build something of your own. I respect that, admire it even, but I've come to believe that building something together might be even better than building something alone." Harriet's heart hammered in her chest. "Hank, are you asking you to marry me?" "Yes, I am." His blue eyes held hers, honest and unwavering. "I love you, Harriet Sullivan. I think I started falling in love with you that first morning in my cabin, when you apologized for not being pretty, and I realized I'd never seen anyone more beautiful in my life." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes, unexpected emotion welling up at his simple declaration. "Oh, Hank." "You don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "I know it's sudden, and you have your teaching to consider. I wouldn't ask you to give that up. We could make it work, you teaching during the week, coming to the ranch on weekends until the school term ends. Then, if you wanted to continue teaching next year, I'd support that. Or if you wanted to focus on our home, our family, I'd support that too." He squeezed her hand gently. "I just want to be with you, Harriet. The details we can figure out together." Harriet's mind raced. Marriage to Hank would change everything: her carefully constructed independence, her focus on her career, her daily routines. Yet as she looked at him, this good, honorable man who had opened his heart to her so fully, she realized that independence might be a hollow victory if it meant denying the love they had found. "Yes," she said simply. Hank blinked, as if he hadn't expected an immediate answer. "Yes. Yes, I'll marry you." Harriet's voice grew stronger with certainty. "I love you, Hank Blackwood. I think I've loved you since that day you told me I was beautiful every hour." Joy transformed Hank's face, erasing the worry lines that had creased his brow. In one fluid motion, he pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of promise and passion and a future unfolding before them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and a little dazed, Hank pressed his forehead to hers. "I don't have a ring," he admitted. "I wasn't sure you'd say yes." Harriet laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. "I don't need a ring, just you and the life we'll build together." They were married 3 weeks later in the Silverton church with the entire town in attendance. Mrs. Abernathy cried openly, declaring it the most romantic thing she'd ever witnessed. Mayor Wilson gave a speech about the importance of education and family values that went on rather longer than necessary. Mrs. Jenkins had sewn Harriet a wedding dress of cream-colored wool, with lace trim, simple but elegant. Hank, standing tall and proud in a new suit ordered specially from Denver, looked at his bride as if she were the sun and moon and stars combined. When they spoke their vows, his voice was clear and strong, his eyes never leaving hers. "I promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life," he said, the traditional words imbued with personal meaning. "To see your beauty in every moment, every hour." Harriet's heart swelled with love as she made her own promises, sealing their future together before God and community. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, a luxury Hank had insisted upon, despite Harriet's protests that his cabin would suit them fine. "We'll have plenty of nights at the ranch," he'd said. "Let's start our marriage with something special." The next morning, Harriet woke to find Hank watching her, a soft smile playing at his lips. Suddenly self-conscious, she raised a hand to her tousled hair. "I must look a fright," she murmured. Hank caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "You're beautiful every hour, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "But never more so than right now, with the morning sun on your face and love in your eyes." Harriet's heart filled to overflowing. She had traveled west, seeking independence and purpose. She had found those things, yes, but also something she hadn't known: she was looking for a partner, a home, a love that made her more rather than less herself. As Hank drew her into his arms, Harriet silently thanked whatever fate or providence had overturned that stagecoach, setting her on a path that led, ultimately, to this moment of perfect belonging. Winter came to Wyoming Territory with a vengeance that year. The first snow fell in mid-October, as Hank had predicted, dusting the landscape with white. By November, serious storms were rolling through regularly, sometimes confining them to the ranch for days at a time. Harriet had continued teaching through the fall term, riding to town with Hank on Monday mornings and returning to the ranch on Friday evenings. The arrangement worked well enough, though the separation during the week was difficult for both of them. When the Christmas holiday brought a temporary end to the school term, Harriet was secretly relieved to settle into ranch life full-time. The cabin that had seemed snug when she first visited now felt like the center of her world. Hank had added a lean-to kitchen before their marriage, giving Harriet space to cook and bake. Together, they had created a home that combined his practical frontier knowledge with her Eastern refinement books lined crude but serviceable shelves. Wildflowers dried from summer blooms added color to the winter landscape indoors, and Harriet's prized china teacups sat alongside Hank's sturdy tin camp mugs. They developed rhythms and routines that suited them both. Mornings began early, with Hank tending to the livestock while Harriet prepared breakfast. Afterward, they would work together on whatever tasks the day required: repairing equipment, preserving food, tending to indoor projects when the weather was too harsh for outside work. Evenings were spent by the fire, reading aloud from Hank's mother's books or simply talking, sharing thoughts and dreams as the wind howled outside their snug cabin. As Christmas approached, Harriet found herself creating new traditions that blended her Boston upbringing with Hank's simpler frontier customs. She fashioned decorations from pine cones and berries, baked gingerbread using precious spices Hank had traded for in town, and set aside small gifts she'd been crafting in secret moments: a new scarf knitted from soft wool, a bookmark embroidered with an aspen leaf design. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after a simple but satisfying dinner, Harriet gathered her courage for an announcement she'd been holding close for several weeks. "I have an early Christmas gift for you," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement and nerves. "Something that can't be wrapped." Hank looked up from the piece of wood he'd been whittling, curiosity in his eyes. "Is that so? Sounds intriguing." Harriet took a deep breath, then placed her hand gently over her still flat stomach. "Come June, we'll be 3 instead of 2. For a moment, Hank simply stared, comprehension dawning slowly across his features. Then he was on his knees before her chair, his hands covering hers, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "A baby," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell. "We're having a baby." Harriet nodded, her own eyes filling at the wonder in his expression. "Dr. Turner confirmed it when we were in town last week. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Hank pressed his face against her middle, his shoulders shaking with emotion. When he looked up at her again, his cheeks were wet but his smile was radiant. "This is the greatest gift I could ever receive," he said, his voice rough. "A child, our child." He rose, pulling her gently to her feet and into his embrace. "Thank you," he murmured against her hair, "for coming west. For finding me. For making me the happiest man in Wyoming Territory." As snow fell softly outside their window and the fire crackled in the hearth, Harriet held her husband close, marveling at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a Boston schoolteacher seeking independence to a Wyoming rancher's wife expecting their first child, it was not the life she had planned. But it was infinitely richer, deeper, and more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. "I love you, Hank Blackwood," she whispered. "Every hour of every day." "And I love you, Harriet Blackwood," he replied, his hand cradling her face with infinite tenderness. "Beautiful in the morning, beautiful always, and carrying our future within you." Outside, the Wyoming winter raged on, wild and unforgiving. But inside their small cabin, Harriet and Hank had created a haven of warmth and love, a foundation strong enough to weather any storm. As they stood together in the firelight, arms entwined and hearts beating as one, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in a person, in the family they were building, in the love that had transformed two solitary journeys into one shared adventure. The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. There would be challenges. Of course, the harsh realities of frontier life didn't disappear simply because one was in love, but they would face them together, stronger for the bond they shared. And when June arrived, bringing with it wildflowers and warm breezes and the cry of their newborn son, Henry James Blackwood, the circle of their love would widen to include this new life, this embodiment of hope and continuity in a land where both were precious commodities. This was the true meaning of home, Harriet reflected as she drifted to sleep in her husband's arms on that snowy Christmas Eve. Not independence alone, not solitude, but connection to the land, to community, to the one person who saw your true self and loved you not despite your imperfections, but because of the unique beauty they created. "You're beautiful every hour," Hank had told her that first morning in his cabin. It had seemed like a simple compliment at the time, but now Harriet understood it for what it truly was: a promise, a philosophy, a way of seeing the world and each other that would sustain them through whatever life might bring. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Wyoming wilderness in pristine white. Inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Harriet and Hank Blackwood dreamed of spring, of new life, and of the beautiful hours stretching endlessly before them.